The celebration had been going on for 6 rotations. 6 full rotations of Velithar Prime's twin moons crossing the sky, and still the Galactic Armada had not stopped singing. They sang in the old way, the Veth way, where 17 voices layered on top of each other like water falling into water, each frequency chosen to resonate with the bones of whoever stood nearby. It was not music the way other species understood it. It was closer to a declaration. A biological announcement that said, "We are here, we have survived, and the universe has confirmed our right to exist." Admiral Sova Wren stood at the observation deck of the flagship Unbroken Meridian and listened to her crew sing. She did not join them. She never did. Singing was for those who had finished their work, and Sova had not finished hers. She was not sure she ever would be. The Unbroken Meridian was the largest vessel in the Veth Armada, 3 kilometers of layered resonance hull, built not from metal the way primitive civilizations built things, but from compressed sound. Specifically, this comes from the crystallized vibrational memory of dying stars. The Veth had discovered 4,000 years ago that stars did not simply explode. They screamed. And if you were patient enough and precise enough in your instruments, you could catch that scream and fold it into something solid. Something that remembered what it once was and was, therefore, incredibly reluctant to be destroyed. That was why Veth ships were nearly indestructible. That was why the Armada had won. The war against the Drovan Collective had lasted 11 years. 11 years of contested nebulae, of station sieges that stretched across months, of quiet evacuations in the middle of night cycles where entire populations were moved like pieces on a board no one fully understood. The Drovan were not cruel in the same way that stories made enemies cruel. They were methodical. They expanded because expansion was what their biology demanded. Their reproductive cycle required new mineral deposits every generation, and they had simply run out of space. They had looked at the mid-spiral territories and seen a solution. The fact that 17 other species already lived in those territories was, to the Drovan, a secondary concern. Not cruelty. Just mathematics. The Veth had been the ones to say no. Not because the Veth were particularly heroic. Sova would be the first to correct anyone who said that. The Veth had said no because the mid-spiral territories contained 3 Veth colony worlds, and the Veth did not give up colony worlds. What began as self-defense became, over years and through alliances forged in desperation, something that looked, from the outside, like a noble stand. Sova had learned to stop correcting that impression. The final battle had been at the Karath Passage, a narrow corridor of navigable space between 2 dense asteroid fields. The Drovan had chosen it deliberately. They were methodical, remember? They had calculated that the Armada, if forced to fight in a compressed space, would lose the advantage of their resonance weapons, which needed room to propagate. The Drovan had been correct in their calculation. They had simply miscalculated one variable. The Veth had not won at Karath Passage because of their resonance weapons. They had won because Admiral Sova Wren had ordered every ship to go silent. Complete electromagnetic silence. No communications. No active sensors. No resonance at all. Just 17 ships drifting in the dark like rocks, while the Drovan fleet moved through the passage looking for them. And then, when the Drovan formation was at its most extended, when the rear of their fleet was still entering the passage and the front was already through, Sova had given the only command she issued that day. She had said, "Now." 17 ships had activated simultaneously. Not their weapons first. Their engines. Full thrust directly into the Drovan formation's middle. Ships that moved like thrown stones, and at those speeds, a ship was a weapon. The resonance hulls had held. The Drovan ships had not. It was not elegant. It was not the kind of victory that made for enjoyable singing. But it was a victory. And so, 6 rotations of celebration. The Armada gathered at Velithar Station, joined by delegations from every species in the Mid-Spiral Alliance. The tall, branching Isom with their photosynthetic crests lit gold in the station lights. The small and ancient Perith, who moved in coordinated clusters of 9 and communicated primarily through synchronized blink patterns. And the aquatic Divari, who traveled in pressurized mobile tanks and left trails of bioluminescent bubbles wherever they went. Everyone is celebrating. Everyone is singing their version of "We Survived." Sova stood at the observation deck and watched the stars. The stars did not celebrate. They just continued being stars, burning, radiating, slowly dying in the way that everything slowly died when you had enough patience to watch. Admiral. Her second officer, a young Veth named Callow, appeared at her shoulder. Callow was 70 years old, which among the Veth made him barely an adult. He had the wide, pale secondary eyes of his generation, A genetic adaptation that had appeared in Veth born after prolonged exposure to deep space travel. Evolution happening fast enough to observe. The Parath delegation is asking again if you'll address the celebration assembly. Tell them I'm reviewing navigation charts. I already used that one. Twice. Sova turned from the viewport. She was tall even for a Veth, nearly 2.5 meters, her resonance ridge running the full length of her spine, visible through the thin material of her uniform as a raised, slightly luminescent line. Her face was narrow, her primary eyes a deep amber, her expression set in the particular configuration that Callow had privately catalogued as Admiral being reasonable, which is worse than Admiral being angry. Tell them I'm sleeping. You don't sleep, Admiral. They know that. Everyone knows that. Tell them I'm trying to sleep and that I resent the interruption. Callow opened his mouth then closed it. He had been her second officer for 3 years. He had learned which arguments to attempt and which to abandon. Yes, Admiral. He turned to go. Callow. He stopped. Have the long-range arrays been recalibrated since the Karath passage? Callow blinked his secondary eyes, a Veth gesture that meant something between, I'm surprised you asked that, and, I should have thought of that myself. The technicians said they'd complete the recalibration by the end of the celebration period. They wanted, he paused. They wanted to celebrate first. Let them celebrate, Sova said. But have them run a passive sweep first. No active emissions. Just listening. Listening for what? She looked back at the stars. I don't know, she said. That's what bothers me. Callow did what she asked. He always did. He went to the sensor bay where 3 technicians were in the middle of a shared meal, and he asked them, politely, to please run a passive long-range sweep of all vectors before they returned to their celebration. They grumbled, politely, because Callow inspired politeness in people. It was genuinely one of his most useful qualities, and one of them went to the console and began the sweep while the other 2 continued eating. The sweep took 40 minutes. When it finished, the technician who had run it sat very still for a long time. It was long enough for the other 2 technicians to stop eating and look at her. Callow, who had stayed in the bay because Sova's instincts had never been wrong in 3 years of service, moved to stand behind her and look at the results over her shoulder, long enough that he could see them clearly. Then Callow went very still too. The sweep had found something. Not close. Not yet. But not as far away as anything should have been, out here in the post-battle quiet of a system that everyone in the galaxy knew was occupied by a victorious armada in the middle of a celebration. The sweep had found mass signatures. Multiple. Moving in formation. Coming from a vector that did not correspond to any known travel lane, mapped transit corridor, or recorded path of allied or neutral species. Coming from the direction of deep space. From the direction of outside the charted mid-spiral, outside the Drovan territories, outside the regions that any of the Alliance's combined surveys had reached. Coming from somewhere that, as far as the combined knowledge of every civilization in the Galactic Armada was concerned, contained nothing. Or had, until now, appeared to. Callow contacted Admiral Wren. He did not use words. He simply opened a channel and transmitted the sensor data directly to her personal display. There was a pause of approximately 4 seconds. Then Sova's voice came over the channel, hushed, very level, in the tone that Callow had catalogued as Admiral has already processed this and is now deciding what to do next. How many? She asked. Callow looked at the data again. He wanted to make sure. He rechecked the mass calculations, the formation spacing, and the velocity readings. He cross-referenced against every known vessel class in the Alliance database and the captured Drovan technical files. Nothing matched. These were not Drovan. These were not any species anyone had catalogued. And they were large. 12 confirmed, he said. Possibly more obscured by the lead vessel's sensor shadow. He paused. Admiral. The mass readings on the largest signatures. He stopped again. He was not a person given to drama. He was precise and careful and did not overstate. But the numbers in front of him were requiring him to rebuild his internal sense of scale in real time, and that was disorienting. The largest signatures are larger than Velithar Station. Velithar Station had a mass of 4.7 billion metric tons. Sova did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was exactly the same as before. Increase to battle station readiness. Do not broadcast any alert on open frequencies. Inform the senior officers of every Armada vessel by tight beam only. And Callow? Yes, Admiral. Do not tell the celebration assembly. Because it would cause panic? Because, she said, we don't know what this is yet. And I will not ruin what these people have earned because of something I don't yet understand. Outside the viewport, The 17 voices of the Armada celebration continued to layer into each other, frequency over frequency, the ancient Veth declaration of survival rising through the hull of the unbroken meridian like a song that didn't know yet that the universe was about to introduce a new variable. Sova Ren stood in the dark of her private office, watching the mass signatures move, and she did the thing she had done since she was a young officer learning to navigate difficult probabilities. She waited. She watched. She tried to understand before she acted. The shapes in the dark kept moving. Patient as stones. Vast as silence. Coming. There was a concept in old Veth cosmological philosophy, one that most modern Veth considered a metaphor rather than a fact, called Mayrath. Roughly translated, it meant the memory of space. The idea was this: space was not actually empty. It had never been. Everything that had ever moved through any region of space left a trace, a residual vibration, undetectable by conventional sensors, present nonetheless. The vacuum was, in this philosophy, an archive. A record of all passage, all heat, all mass, all intention. If you had instruments sensitive enough, and more importantly, if you had a mind trained to interpret what those instruments found, you could, theoretically, read the void the way you read a text. You could know who had passed through any region of space and when, and in what state of urgency, and carrying what emotional weight, because emotion produced chemistry, chemistry produced heat, and heat left traces. Admiral Sova Ren had been told, as a student, that Mayrath was poetry. Useful for meditation. Not science. She was now standing in the sensor bay of the unbroken meridian, staring at data that was making her think the old philosophers had been understated. Run the spectral analysis again, she said. Technician Ova, the one who had first found the signatures, ran it again. She had now run it 4 times at Sova's request, and each time the result was the same, and each time Sova's expression went slightly more interior, as though she was pressing the data against the architecture of everything she knew and watching what bent. The mass signatures were not just large. They were architecturally impossible by Veth engineering standards. The unbroken meridian, built from compressed stellar scream, was an extraordinary achievement, 3 kilometers of hull that remembered being a star. But these incoming vessels, the large ones, the ones that made Callow do math 3 times because he thought he'd made an error, registered at approximately 47 kilometers in their longest dimension. 47 kilometers. Not of station. Of ship. Of something that moved through space under directed power. What's the drive signature? Sova asked. Ova highlighted the relevant section of the analysis. That's the problem, Admiral. There isn't one. Not exactly. They're moving, but I can't identify a propulsion method. There's thermal output, significant thermal output, but it doesn't correlate with any drive type in our records. Not gravitational fold. Not resonance pulse. She hesitated. It looks almost as if the heat is coming from inside the ships themselves. The vessels are running hot internally as a byproduct of something else. The movement might be secondary. Sova looked at her. Secondary to what? I don't know. Sova pulled up the formation display. 12 confirmed mass signatures. She was now fairly certain there were 14, with 2 hanging at the edge of detection, possibly intentionally hanging there. Possibly observing. The formation was not aggressive in any configuration she recognized. It was not a combat spread. It was not a blockade formation. It was not the exploratory fan arrangement that most species adopted when approaching unknown territory. It was a column. Single file roughly. One behind the other, with the 2 largest vessels at the front and the smaller vessels, smaller meaning, in this context, approximately 8 to 12 kilometers, trailing behind. A procession. They're not attacking, Callow said from beside her. He had been quiet since delivering the initial data, processing in the careful way that was his nature. A procession formation has no tactical advantage. You would never approach a potentially hostile fleet in column formation. You can't bring weapons to bear efficiently, you can't maneuver, and you can't absorb an attack without the whole column folding on itself. Unless, Sova said, you're not concerned about our weapons. The bay was quiet. Outside, muffled through the hull, the celebration continued. Someone had introduced an instrument, a Duvari pressure harp whose resonance frequencies were low enough that they could be felt more than heard through a ship's hull, a slow rolling vibration like ocean tides. Get me Commander Thren, Sova said. Thren was her chief intelligence officer, an older Veth, one of the generation before Callow's, with the smaller secondary eyes of a deeper past and a mind like a carefully maintained archive. And tell the ISOM delegation I need to speak with their senior historian. The historian? Not their military liaison. Military liaison, Sova said, assumes the present is a military situation. I'm not sure it is. She looked at the column of vast shapes moving through the dark. I want someone who knows things that happened before the current order of things. Before the Alliance. Before the Drovan expansion. Before the Armada. Callow hesitated. How far before? Sova didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the spectral analysis again, specifically at a small detail Ova had flagged almost as an afterthought, in the lower right section of the display. A secondary reading almost lost in the noise of the larger data. A faint electromagnetic signature layered underneath the thermal output. Faint but patterned. Repeating. Not random. Not instrument noise. Something that, if you were looking for voices and static, sounded almost like language. As far as their records go, she said. The ISOM historian's name was Vessels of Consideration Filled, which was a proper ISOM name and reflected, in the branching syllable structure of ISOM naming conventions, both her lineage and her intellectual specialty. She went by Vessels in cross-species settings, which she had long accepted with the gracious patience that the ISOM applied to most of the galaxy's shortcomings. She was old. ISOM's age was difficult to translate directly, but the gold in her photosynthetic crest had deepened to something closer to amber, and her branching upper limbs, which in younger ISOM were slender and quick, had thickened over decades into something that moved with the deliberate weight of old trees. She was, by any measure, one of the most extensively educated beings in the Mid-Spiral Alliance. She held memory banks, the ISOM term for what other species called degrees, in pre-expansion cosmological history, in xenobiological archaeology, and in something the ISOM called deep pattern recognition, which roughly translated to the study of how civilizations repeated themselves across time and distance. She had been in the middle of the celebration when Callow found her. She had not been singing. She had been sitting in a corner of the assembly space, watching everyone else sing with an expression that Sova, when she saw it via the remote feed Callow had set up, recognized immediately. She had been thinking about the same thing Sova was thinking about. You saw the readings, Sova said when Vessels arrived in the sensor bay. I felt them, Vessels said. Her translation implant rendered her ISOM voice, a complex harmonic of rustling and resonance, into clear, unhurried standard. The pressure harp player stopped. Did you notice? About 20 minutes ago. The Duvari are extraordinarily sensitive to deep space acoustic anomalies. Whatever is coming, it is displacing something at a frequency that the Duvari feel before they can explain. Sova filed that away. The Duvari knew something was wrong, which meant others at the celebration might be starting to sense it. She had limited time before the question became public. Have you seen a formation like this? She asked, pulling up the display. Vessel studied it. Her chest leaves shifted, each one moving slightly independently, which in ISOM physiology indicated deep cognitive engagement. Not in my lifetime, she said. Not in recorded history. She paused. But I have seen references to something like this. In the oldest ISOM texts. The ones that predate the current cosmological era. How old? Old enough that most historians classify them as mythology. Vessels touched the display, tracing the column formation with the tip of one branching limb. There is a ISOM story, it is called, in your translation, The Ones Who Left Before the Map Was Made. It describes a species, or perhaps a category of species, that existed in the early history of this galaxy. Before the current civilizations. This was before even the predecessor civilizations referenced in our oldest records. She paused. They are described as builders. Specifically, builders of the framework, the navigational and physical infrastructure of the deep void. The transit corridors. The stable gravitational channels. The resonance-free zones that allow for fold travel. Sova was very still. The transit corridors weren't natural? Callow asked. He was a young man from a generation that had grown up using transit corridors the way they used atmospheric processors, as background infrastructure, not things anyone had made. The oldest ISOM texts say they were not, Vessels said. They say the galaxy was, in the very early period, effectively unnavigable. That it was made navigable. That someone cleared the paths. She paused again. And then departed. Or withdrew. The texts disagree on this point. Some say they left the galaxy entirely. Some say they went deeper in, further toward the core where no one has ever successfully sent a probe. The texts use a word that does not translate cleanly, but it means something between inward journey and deliberate disappearance. The bay was quiet. And the texts say nothing about why they might return? Sova asked. The texts, Vessels said carefully, say that they would only return if something had gone significantly wrong with the framework they built. She looked at the column of shapes on the display. The texts call it, and again translation is imprecise, a disruption of the designed order. Sova turned to Ova. The Karath Passage battle. What was the nature of the Droven's final engagement? Ova pulled up the battle records. The Droven used compressed mass detonators in the final phase, Admiral. They were attempting to collapse the passage itself, make it unnavigable, so we couldn't use it in a follow-up offensive. Did it work? Partially. The passage is still navigable but structurally degraded. The gravitational channel is... Ova stopped. She was young and quick and she was connecting things in real time. The gravitational channel that the passage follows. It's one of the main deep transit corridors. Yes, Sova said. We damaged it, Kallo said in a quiet voice. In winning the war. We damaged the infrastructure. The Droven damaged it, Sova corrected. We won in spite of it. But yes. She looked at the column. 14 vast shapes, moving in procession, patient as geological time. Someone noticed. The electromagnetic signal in the sensor data pulsed again. Still faint. Still patterned. Still waiting to be understood. I need a linguist, Sova said. The best one on any ship in this armada. She looked at the data. They've been talking to us since they entered detection range, she said. We just haven't been listening in the right way. Her name was Dr. Min Averell, and she had not slept in 31 hours, which was not unusual for her. Min was a xenolinguist attached to the Armada as a civilian specialist. One of 12 linguists the Alliance had embedded in the fleet specifically because the post-war diplomatic period was expected to involve extensive first contact protocols with Droven survivors. She was not Veth. She was Perith, small, moving in the constant subtle coordination of her cluster, currently 3 members, 2 of whom had remained at the celebration and 1 of whom stood beside her, always within arm's reach, because Perith cognition was partially distributed and solo Periths were mildly impaired in the way that having part of your brain in another room would impair most thinking beings. She had been studying the electromagnetic signal for 4 hours when she made the first breakthrough. It's not a language, she said. Not in the way we use that word. Admiral Wren was at her shoulder. Sova had not left the analysis room since she'd brought Min in. Explain. Min's blink patterns were rapid, the Perith equivalent of talking while simultaneously thinking out loud. Language, as we use it, is a compression of meaning. We take a complex state, an idea, an experience, an intention, and we encode it in symbols or sounds that the listener decodes back into meaning. There's always loss in that process. Always a gap between what you mean and what arrives. She pulled up the signal on the large display. This is different. The data is not compressed. There is no encoding step. The signal is the meaning. Directly. A musical chord is not a description of emotion but an emotional state itself. You're saying they transmit meaning without language? I'm saying the distinction between the signal and what it communicates is not there. Which means, Min's cluster partner made a quick movement, and Min paused, incorporating the input from her other self. Which means that any being who receives this signal, regardless of their biological structure, regardless of what sensory apparatus they use, should understand it. Do not translate it. Understand it immediately and completely. The room was quiet. And do you? Sova asked. Understand it? Min turned to her. The Perith face was difficult to read for non-Perith. The primary communication channel was a blink pattern, which Sova could not interpret. But she was a person who had spent decades reading rooms, reading situations, and reading the body language of alien species she'd never trained to read, and what she saw in Min's posture and in the movement of her cluster partner was something she recognized. Fear. Not of danger. Fear of scale. The fear you felt when something was larger than your ability to hold it? Yes, Min said. I understand it. Tell me. Min moved back to the display and pulled up her 4 hours of notes alongside the signal. It's saying several things simultaneously. That's part of what took me so long. I kept trying to find the sequence, the order, because that's how we think about language in sequences. But this text is not sequential. All of it is present at once, the way a chord is present all at once. She looked at the display. The first thing it's saying is, we are aware that you do not know us. Kallo, standing at the back of the room, made a small sound. The second thing, Min continued, is a statement of identity. Not a name, they don't use names in the way we do. It's more like a description of their role in this space. My best attempt at translation is something like, we are the architects of the conditions that allowed your existence. Humble, Thren, the intelligence officer, said dryly. He was an old Veth with no patience for ego in any form and no inclination to revise that standard for entities of significant size. Not humble or arrogant, Min said. Just descriptive. There is no emotional coloring on that statement in the signal. It is said that water is composed of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. Factual. Not a claim of superiority. Just a statement of structural reality. She moved to the next section of her notes. The third thing is the reason they're here. She paused. And this is where I need to be careful with the translation because the signal is doing something very specific in this part. It's shifting from statement to inquiry. It's asking something. It's asking it in a way that suggests it has been waiting a long time to ask and that the question matters to it considerably. She looked at Sova directly. It is asking, do you know what you have done? The room held that question for a moment. And the fourth element, Min said, which I believe is present as context for the third, as the background that makes the question intelligible, is a very clear image. Not a visual. More like a structural diagram. The Karath Passage Transit Corridor's architecture exists in 3 states. Its pre-battle state, its current state, and, she paused. And a third state. A projected state. What it will become if the degradation continues without intervention. What does the third state look like? Sova asked. Min was quiet for a moment. Then she said, collapsed. The corridor is gone. Not just unusable, dissolved into the surrounding gravitational field. And the collapse is not contained. The model the signal contains shows a cascading effect. One corridor destabilizes, the one adjacent to it takes on the compensatory load, which destabilizes it, which... How many corridors? Sova asked. All of them, Min said. In the signal's projection, all of them are included. The entire network. In approximately, she checked her notes. Approximately 300 of your years. 300 years was not a long time on a geological scale. It was not even a long time on a civilizational scale. 300 years ago, the Veth had not yet discovered fold travel. 300 years from now, every species in the Mid-Spiral Alliance would still be alive, would still be traveling, and would still be dependent on a navigational infrastructure that had apparently been engineered by someone who was now parking 14 impossible ships just outside a party and asking politely if anyone had noticed what they'd broken. They want to repair it, Sova said. Not a question. I believe so, Min said. But the signal implies that the repair requires something they don't have. What? Min looked at her notes. She looked at the signal display. She checked her interpretation twice because it was the kind of thing you check twice. It implies that the repair requires consent. The consent is required from those who currently occupy the network. The corridors, as the signal describes them, are not just infrastructure. They are agreements in a way I cannot fully render. They only function because populations continue, generation to generation, to behave in ways that maintain the conditions under which the corridors were built. They are, as best I can understand it, physical manifestations of civilizational coherence. That is, Thren said, either the most profound thing I have ever heard or the most elaborate excuse for an invasion. Both are possible, Min acknowledged. What does the consent require? Sova asked. Min turned back to the signal. Her cluster partner moved closer, and the two of them were very still for a moment, Parath bilateral processing, both selves examining the same data from slightly different cognitive angles, the small gap between them doing the work that the gap in all minds did. A meeting, Min said finally. Face to face. In the space between their fleet and ours, there is a significant gap. She looked at Sova. They are asking for you specifically, Admiral. The signal contains a description that corresponds to you. The signal indicates that the person who made the decisions at the Karath Passage, the way the battle was fought and the particular choice you made, is the one they need to speak to. Why? Min was quiet for a moment. Because the signal says, the one who understands silence understands us. Sova stood very still in the analysis room, looking at the projected image of collapsed transit corridors, listening to the distant vibration of a celebration that was beginning to quiet. The Duvari and their pressure harp had fallen completely silent, and the Veth singing had thinned from 17 voices to perhaps 5, as people began to feel, at the level of their bones, that something was different in the quality of the surrounding space. She thought about the battle at Karath Passage. About the choice to go silent. In that moment she understood what her enemies had not. She thought about the old Veth philosophy of Merath. The memory of empty space. She thought about what it would mean to have built something that lasted 4,000 years and then come back to find it damaged. She thought about what questions she would ask if she were them. Prepare a shuttle, she said. Minimal crew. Myself, Callow, Min, and vessels. She looked at Thren. If I am not back in 12 hours, do not come looking for me. Do not engage. Take the Armada back to Alliance space, deliver everything we have learned to the Council and tell them. She paused. Tell them what? Thren asked. Tell them to behave coherently, she said. Whatever that means. Tell them to figure it out. She walked toward the door. Admiral, Thren said, and something in his voice stopped her, something unfamiliar, something she had to turn around to identify, because Thren did not have a wide range of audible emotional registers, and she was not accustomed to hearing this particular quality in it. It was, she realized, the sound of an old and careful person being afraid. Is this wise? He asked. She considered the question seriously, the way it deserved. No, she said. But I don't think wisdom is what they're asking for. She left. The shuttle was called the Perihelion, and it was the smallest craft on the unbroken meridian that could comfortably hold 4 passengers. A diplomatic courier vessel, designed for exactly the kind of careful, small-scale contact that the Armada had expected to need for post-war Drovan negotiations. No one had expected to need it for this. Callow flew. He was the best pilot among the 4, and piloting occupied the part of his mind that kept wanting to perform the mass calculations again and reach a different number. Min sat beside him in the co-pilot seat, her cluster partner in immediate contact, transmitting and receiving in the distributed Perith way, processing the ongoing signal at a level that was beyond what Min could manage solo. Vessels had folded herself into the rear passenger space with the particular grace of a being who had spent decades in spaces not quite designed for her dimensions, and she was reviewing her oldest records, texts that, before today, she had carried as cultural artifacts rather than practical references. Sova stood at the forward viewport. The column of shapes had stopped. They had stopped approximately 40 minutes ago, stopped perfectly, simultaneously, as if the concept of stopping was not a deceleration but a decision, simply made and instantly executed. No drift. No slowdown curve. Just moving and then not moving. As if movement were a state, these vessels adopted and discarded it the way a mind adopted and discarded a train of thought. The perihelion crossed the distance between the Armada and the column slowly. The 2 lead vessels, the 47-kilometer ones, were now fully visible to the naked eye, which was a cognitive experience that Sova was not entirely prepared for. They were not the shape she had imagined. She had been unconsciously constructing something angular. Something that looked, in her imagination, like a scaled-up version of a warship, because that was what a large vessel meant in her experience. Hard edges. Functional geometry. The engineering language of a vehicle designed to move through space and withstand contact with hostile forces. These were not that. They were curved. Not in a streamlined way, not the curve of something shaped for efficiency. In the way that living things were curved. In the same way that a shell, a wave, or a spine is curved. The surface was not smooth. It was textured in a pattern that Sova's pattern recognition kept trying to resolve into something familiar and kept failing, because the scale at which the texture had meaning was not the scale at which she was observing it. It was like standing too close to a tapestry and seeing only individual threads, knowing there was an image there but unable to step back far enough to see it. The color was not one color. Moved. Not the movement of lighting effects or reflection. The surface itself moved, slowly, the way deep water moved, currents visible below a surface film. The colors were dark, deep greens that shifted toward black, blues that were almost not colors but almost sounds, and the occasional pulse of something that Sova's visual cortex registered as painful to look at directly, not because it was bright but because it was familiar in a way that she could not source. Like a word in a language she had never learned but had somehow heard once in a dream. They're biological, Vessels said from the back, her voice very composed. At least partially. I can see there on the surface, do you see? The rhythmic displacement. They're breathing. Ships that breathe, Callow said. He was holding the shuttle at a stable distance, not approaching further until they had some indication of where to go or what to do. Not ships that breathe, Min said. Ships that are a form of life. Or ships that have become one. Or, she paused. The signal is updating. Something is changing in the signal. She was quiet, processing. Her cluster partners' movements accelerated. They know we're here. They've known since we left the meridian. The signal is, she stopped. Min, Sova said. They're happy, Min said. She sounded surprised. Not in the way we are happy. But there is something in the signal that is the structural equivalent of relief. Of a long wait ending. She listened further. And there is a direction. A location. They want us to approach the lead vessel at. She described a coordinate relative to the vessel's visible geometry. There. between those two surface formations. The ones that look like eyes, Callow said quietly. Yes, Min said. Like eyes. They flew toward the face of something 47 kilometers long that was looking at them and was, in whatever register existed for a being of that nature, glad they had come. Sova had been in difficult rooms before. She had negotiated with Drovan commanders who viewed her as an obstacle to their species' biological necessity. She had sat across from Alliance Council members who viewed her victories as threats to their political arrangements. She had delivered casualty reports to families who had sent people into her care and received different people back or nothing at all. She had navigated every version of this room that she could conceive of, and she had not broken. This was not a room. It was a space, vast and interior, that the perihelion entered through an aperture in the lead vessel's hull that opened as they approached and closed gently behind them and that registered on every instrument as perfectly, specifically designed for them. The dimensions were exactly right for the shuttle. The atmospheric composition that flooded their environmental scanners was exactly their required mix, adjusted slightly for each species, slightly more oxygen-dense than standard for Perith, slightly higher resonance frequency ambience for Veth, and humidity controlled for vessels' photosynthetic comfort. They've known about us for longer than today, Sova said. The texts, Vessels murmured. They described the builders as having been aware. Always. In the way that a gardener is aware of the garden. Not intrusively. Just, keeping track. They landed. Or settled. The shuttle's landing systems engaged out of habit, but the space beneath them had already configured itself to hold the vessel, so the actual landing was more like being caught than landing. They got out. The space was lit in the same moving color as the exterior surface, and the floor was firm and stable but warm. Warm in a way that stone was warm after long sun exposure. Heat from inside, Sova thought. Heat as a byproduct of something else. Like Ova had said. They stood in the center of the space and waited. What came was not sudden. It did not arrive. It became present, gradually, the way dawn became present, the transition too slow to catch the moment of change. Something was not there, and then something was there, and between those two states was a continuous becoming that Sova's eyes could not resolve into a single moment. It was tall. Or it occupied height without being exactly tall. The distinction in her mind between those two things felt important in the moment. It was not solid in a uniform way. Parts of it were very dense, and other parts of it were present the way that heat shimmer was present. Definitely real, definitely there, but without hard edges. It had, Sova thought, the quality of a question that had been waiting a long time for the right listener. It looked at her. She looked back. And then, not in her ears, not through any sensory organ she could specifically identify, but in the same place that music landed when it worked the way music was supposed to work, she heard it speak. You know what silence is, it said. Most of them don't. Most of them think silence is the absence of sound. You know it as something else. Yes, Sova said. Out loud. She was not sure if the out loud mattered to it, but it mattered to her. She was a person who said things aloud. Silence is a decision. Yes, it said. And so is everything we built. What followed was not a conversation in any form Sova had experienced. It was not even, precisely, an exchange. It was more like the entity. She had stopped trying to find a category for it and had started thinking of it simply as the architect, which felt inadequate but less misleading than any alternative, was a structure through which information moved, and she was the receiving end of that structure, and what moved through was not answers but context. The background that made the answers possible. Min was recording everything. Vessels was perfectly still, her crest leaves wide open, photosynthetic tissue active in a way that suggested she was processing light at a different frequency than normal, the ISOM equivalent of bearing witness. Callow was standing very precisely at Sova's shoulder, doing the thing he did in difficult moments, being exactly where he was supposed to be, making no unnecessary movements, and generating no noise that wasn't necessary. The architect had been, not here. Not in this galaxy. But not gone, not in the way the ISOM text described it. Inward was the wrong word too. It had been in something the architect described, through the direct meaning transmission that Min was attempting to decode in real time, as a deeper register. Not a place. A mode. A frequency of existence that was simultaneous with this one but not in contact with it. The way that two sound waves could occupy the same space without interacting, unless something disturbed one of them. The corridors, the transit network that underlay all fold travel in the mid-spiral, had been that disturbance. Not the corridors themselves but a specific event along them. A resonance cascade. The Drovan's compressed mass detonators at Karath Passage had caused a tiny crack in one of the load points of the corridor network, which was too small for any of the Alliance's instruments to notice. The network, the architect explained, was not static infrastructure. It was dynamic. It was maintained by the activity of the civilizations using it, their travel, their communication, and their collective coherent intention as expressed in all the ways that living populations expressed intention. There was, in the architect's rendering of it, no meaningful distinction between the infrastructure of a civilization and the civilization itself. They were expressions of the same underlying order. The fracture was not in the physical corridor. It was in the coherence. The war, specifically the Drovan's decision to make the framework of the galaxy into a weapon, had introduced a different kind of activity into the corridor network. An incoherent signal. The accumulated resonance of 11 years of conflict, displacement, mass casualties and broken continuities. The compressed mass detonator had been a catalyst, not a cause. It had crystallized what was already degrading. How long has it been degrading? Sova asked. The answer was not in years. It was in a unit the architect used that corresponded, in Min's careful translation, to generations of coherent intention. The degradation had begun approximately 400 years ago. Long before the Drovan expansion. Long before the current war. What happened 400 years ago? Callow asked. The architect's response was not what Sova expected. It said, "You stopped remembering what you were for." The room held that. What were we for? Sova asked. The architect said something that took Min nearly 10 minutes to express in words. Not because it was complex, but because, in Min's later words, it was the kind of simple truth that language was invented specifically to obscure. You were for each other, it said. The framework was built so that you could reach each other. The corridors exist so that the mid-spiral could become, over time, a single coherent community. Not uniform, the network is not meant to make everything the same. It is meant to make communication possible. Contact is possible. The slow, effortful, imperfect process of understanding is possible. It paused. The architect paused, which was itself unexpected, a beat in the transmission that felt like emphasis or grief. The Drovan were not wrong about needing space, it said. They were mistaken about what kind of space. They needed to be heard. The network would have allowed them to be heard. They chose instead to take. And what was not given became a war, and the war became a fracture, and now the network, which exists to make understanding possible, is breaking under the weight of what could not be understood. Sova was quiet for a long time. And you can repair it? She finally asked. We can repair the physical damage, the architect said. We cannot repair the condition that caused the physical damage. We can restore the corridor to its prior structure. We cannot restore the coherence. We have never had the ability to do that. Because it has to come from us. Because it has to come from you, it is confirmed. It always has. We built the framework. We could not build the will to use it. Sova thought of the celebration. 6 rotations of singing, every species in the Alliance expressing their survival and their relief. She thought of the Duvari who had stopped playing when the signal arrived, and what it said about the Duvari that they felt it before any instrument detected it. She thought of the Parath distributed across their clusters. Cognition spread between themselves in a way that no other species had evolved, and whether that was a coincidence or, in some ancient and non-deliberate way, an adaptation shaped by a network that rewarded coherence. She thought about the Drovan. The Drovan that survived the war, she said. Where did they go? They were granted refuge in the outer mid-spiral by joint alliance agreement, Callow said quietly. Sova looked at the architect. They're still part of the network. Even in refuge. Whatever happens to the network, they're in it too. Yes, said the architect. Did they know about the corridors, the fracture, and the cascade? They knew that they were desperate, the architect said. Desperation is not knowledge. No, Sova said. It isn't. She stood in the vast interior of something that breathed, surrounded by moving light and the warm exhalation of a being so old that it had been present when the galaxy was young, and she thought about the question she had been asked. Do you know what you have done? She had thought, when Min first translated it, that it was an accusation. She had been preparing, in the back of her mind, for the version of this meeting where she was tried for something. Where the scale of these entities was exercised as judgment. It was not that. It was genuine curiosity. The architect truly wanted to know. Not whether she felt guilt. Guilt was a small instrument for a large problem, but whether she understood. Whether she saw, clearly, the full shape of the thing that had happened and continued to happen and would continue to happen if nothing changed. I know part of it, she said. I know we broke something we didn't know existed. I know the breaking has been longer than the war. I know that winning and fixing are different things, and that we celebrated winning before we checked what the cost was. She paused. I don't know what to do about the Droven, about the coherence, or about whether the people I came here with are capable of the kind of community you're describing, over the kind of time you're describing, without some of them choosing to take instead of ask. We know, said the architect. We have never encountered a civilization that was incapable of choosing to take. Does that mean it's inevitable? The collapse. It means, said the architect, that it has never not been a choice. And choices can be remade. Sova looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, I need to bring others here. Not my officers. The Alliance Council. The Droven survivors. Everyone who was in that war and everyone who will live in what comes after. She paused. Can you hold the degradation? By time for what you're describing, the community, the coherence, to become a realistic possibility rather than a philosophical hope. How much time do you need? The architect asked. Sova thought about it seriously. She thought about the Alliance Council and its politics. She thought about the Droven, their grief and their displaced necessity. She thought about species that communicated in blinks, species that thought in distributed clusters, and species that built ships from the screams of dying stars, and about the extraordinary difficulty and necessity of all of them finding a language for each other that was not the language of war. A generation, she said. 25 years. Enough for the children who were born into this war to grow up and inherit what comes after it. Enough for the people who made the choices that fractured things to be accountable for those choices while they're still alive to be accountable. Enough to try. The architect considered this. It was considering, Sova realized, actually considering, not performing consideration. It was running some calculation that she didn't have the mathematics for, in a register she couldn't access, with variables that included things she would never fully understand. Then it said, yes. We can hold it. And then, quieter, something in the transmission that Min later said she almost didn't catch. We were hoping you would ask for time rather than a solution. Why? Sova asked. Because, said the architect, everyone who has ever asked us for a solution has found, eventually, that we gave them something they stopped understanding. Time is the only thing we have ever given anyone that they did not lose. They flew back in silence. The perihelion crossed the space between the column and the unbroken meridian in silence. Not the strategic silence of Karath Passage, but the silence of four people who had looked at something enormous and were now sitting with the size of it. It was Vessels who spoke first. I need to contact the ISOM archive immediately, she said. The oldest texts. There are things in them I dismissed as metaphor. I need to reread them. She paused. I need to reread everything. There will be others like you, Sova said. In every species. People who had old knowledge considered the current age a myth. We'll need them. A council of the forgotten, Vessels said, and there was something in her voice, some frequency of emotion that Sova could not name but recognized as the sound of an ancient person finding that the thing they had given their life to turned out to matter. Min, Sova said. I'm processing, Min said. She and her cluster partner were both very still, in the way that Perith went still when their distributed cognition was running at capacity. The direct meaning signal. What the architect used. She paused. I think I can approximate it. Not perfectly. Not at their scale. But I think I understand the principle well enough to engineer something. A communication protocol that removes some of the encoding loss. Not all of it. But, another pause. Enough maybe. Enough for species that have been talking past each other to start actually arriving. That's what we need, Sova said. Exactly that. Callow flew. His secondary eyes were moving in a pattern that Sova, after 3 years, had learned to read. Rapid lateral tracking, the Veth equivalent of running through implications. The Droven, he said. Yes. They won't trust us. We defeated them. The fleet I'm flying back toward just spent 11 years fighting them. If we go to the council and say we need to build a community with the Droven, the first question they'll ask is why. And the answer, that the galaxy will stop working in 300 years, is the kind of answer that sounds like manipulation. It is the kind of answer that sounds like manipulation, Sova agreed. We'll need to show them. Not the architect. That would be overwhelming, presented without context. The data first. The network first. The science of what the corridors actually are. She paused. People can dismiss a story. It's harder to dismiss physics. And if they still don't believe it? Then we start with the ones who do and we build from there. She looked at the unbroken meridian, growing larger in the viewport as Callow brought them in. The celebration lights were still on at Velithar Station. From this distance the station looked small and bright and fragile, the way all inhabited things look from the outside. Coherence doesn't require unanimity. It requires enough. I don't know what enough is. But I know it starts somewhere, and I know what happens if it starts nowhere. Callow nodded. He began the docking approach. The Armada is going to have questions. The Armada has earned questions. She stood up from the observer's seat, straightening her uniform, running the resonance ridge along her spine through the grounding exercise she had learned as a young officer, the Veth equivalent of a deep breath. Let them ask. What do you tell Thren? Sova considered. Thren had looked afraid when she left. Thren, a soldier his entire life, understood the world best when it divided cleanly into threats and non-threats, and now he would be handed something that was neither. I tell him the truth, she said. I tell him we have 25 years and a problem that cannot be solved by the Armada, but that the Armada will be necessary too. I tell him that winning the war was the easy part. She paused. Which he won't like. No, Callow said, and something in his voice made her look at him, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one, in the way that his generation expressed things, indirectly through implication. But he'll do it anyway. Yes, she said. He will. The perihelion entered the unbroken Meridian's docking bay. The bay lights came on. The mechanical catches engaged. The massive ship held the small one gently, the way large things held small things when they were, at their core, designed for care. Outside, the column of vast and ancient shapes remained still. Waiting. Holding. The Armada moved around them in their celebration, voices quieting now, people beginning to sense that the nature of the moment had shifted in some way they could not yet name. The Duvari were completely silent. The Isolm's crests were shifting. Even the Veth, who generally distrusted unassigned feelings, moved to the viewports to look out at the void and sensed, through their resonance ridges, that the void was different. Something had changed in the quality of what the space remembered. Sova Wren walked off the perihelion and into the organized, prepared, complex work of the rest of her life. When crowded, the briefing room of the unbroken Meridian could accommodate 20 people. Sova had put 31 in it. Every senior officer on every Armada vessel is present via tight beam projection. Commander Thren stood in person against the back wall, arms folded and expression set in the configuration that meant I have already prepared 17 objections and am ordering them by priority. Min and her cluster partner with their recordings and their translation notes. Vessels, who had spent the shuttle journey rereading her oldest texts and had emerged from that process with what Sova could only describe as the look of someone who had been vindicated on a scale that was almost more burden than relief. Sova stood at the front of the room and told them everything. She did not soften it. She did not lead with the parts that were less confronting and saved the difficult material for when they were warmed up. She had learned over decades that telling the full truth at the beginning was less damaging than revealing it in pieces over time, because pieces of the truth allowed people to construct comforting false versions of the incomplete information, which then had to be dismantled as well. She told them about the architect. This section discusses the corridor network and its true nature. This section discusses the fracture, the cascade, and the 300-year timeline. About 25 years. About what the architect had said regarding coherence and community and what the corridors were actually for. She told them about the Droven. That was where the room changed. It didn't become loud. The officers of the Galactic Armada were professionals. They had seen enough to know that loud reactions were a waste of energy that could be spent on understanding. But she could see it in their faces, their postures, their physiology, each species expressing the same interior disruption in their own biological vocabulary. Shock, then resistance, then the beginning of something slower and more complicated that wasn't quite acceptance but was oriented in that direction. Thren waited until she finished. Then he said, "You're asking us to treat the Droven as partners in the survival of a network they tried to weaponize." "I'm asking the Alliance Council to treat them as partners," Sova said. "I'm asking you to support me in making that argument to the Council. The Council will say the Droven should be held responsible." "The Droven should be," Sova said. "Accountability and partnership are not mutually exclusive. We can require accountability and build something with them at the same time. We can't build the coherence the architect described if we exclude 11 billion beings who live inside the same network we're trying to save. 11 billion beings who spent 11 years trying to kill us," said one of the tight beam projections, Captain Ven of the Steady Current, whose crew had lost 40 people at the third station siege of Kethra. Her voice was level. She was not being unreasonable. She was being honest about the weight she was carrying, and Sova respected that. "Yes," Sova said. "Those same 11 billion beings." She held Captain Ven's gaze across the projection. I'm not asking anyone in this room to forgive. I'm asking everyone in this room to survive. And I am telling you as clearly as I know how to, that survival requires a shape that includes people we have good reasons to hate. She paused. I have good reasons to hate them too. 17 people under my command died at Karath Passage. I made choices at Karath Passage that I will think about for the rest of my life. I am not standing here as someone who has transcended this. She pressed the words deliberately. I stand here as someone who has examined the physics and chosen the future over hatred. You can do the same. The room was quiet. Thren unfolded his arms. This was, Sova knew, his signal that an objection had been heard and categorized and the objection phase was ending. He was moving into implementation. The Council, he said. Who presents this legislation to the Council? I do, Sova said. Alone? With Min and her recordings. With vessels and the historical context. She looked around the room. And with anyone in this room who wants to stand next to me when I make this argument. Anyone who wants to say with their presence, we were there, we fought it, and we are telling you this is the next step. She paused. I'm not ordering anyone. That is a request. She let it sit. The first person to speak was the tight beam projection of a young Duvari captain, barely adult by Duvari reckoning, appointed to command because the war had moved through the senior officers fast. The Duvari's translation implant rendered their bubble and pressure communication into standard in real time, and their voice was calm and clear. The Duvari fleet will stand with the admiral. Then, a ISOM captain, one of Vessel's former students, who said nothing but whose crest unfurled to full extension, the ISOM gesture of declared intent. Then, Ven from the steady current who said, I don't forgive them but I'll stand there. Then, one by one tight beam projection and physical presence alike. Thren was last. He had turned to face the viewport, looking out at the column of ancient shapes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said without turning, the Veth have a philosophical concept. Mera. The memory of empty space. He paused. I dismissed it as poetry when I was young. I'm no longer young. Another pause. I'll stand there, Admiral. Good, Sova said. Not because I believe it will work, Thren said. He turned from the viewport. Because I believe not trying is a choice I would rather not make. That's enough, Sova said. That is always enough. Before she went to the Alliance Council, Sova went to the Drovan. This was not in any plan anyone had approved. It was not the strategically obvious move. There were 14 advisors who would have, if consulted, told her to go to the Council first, establish the framework, build the political structure, and then present it to the Drovan as a fait accompli, giving them less room to say no and less room to complicate the architecture. Sova did not consult the advisors. She went to the Drovan because the architect had said they knew that they were desperate. And because she had been thinking for days about the signal's phrase, do you know what you have done? She quietly decided that she needed to understand the full history of how the present had been made before standing in any room and arguing for a particular shape of the future. The Drovan refuge was called Sector Marith, not a name of Drovan origin but an Alliance administrative designation, which told you something about the care with which the post-war settlement had been managed. It was a region of the outer mid-spiral that had been considered marginally habitable, sufficient mineral deposits for Drovan reproductive cycle needs, but barely. It was the kind of place offered to a defeated people, kept alive as a political concession rather than welcomed as a community. Sova was received by the Drovan interlocutor, a representative role created specifically for post-war communication with non-Drovan parties, filled by a being called Third Voice of Methodical Consideration, which she asked to be addressed as Third Voice, which it accepted with the particular Drovan grace of a species for whom the simplification of communication protocols was a sign of trust rather than disrespect. Third Voice was smaller than Sova had expected. She had been briefed on Drovan physiology, the segmented form, the multiple manipulator limbs, and the chemoreceptive communication that the translation implant converted to standard. But the briefing had been written during the war, and the Drovan she had been briefed about was a military species expanding to kill. The person in front of her was not that. It was worn out, in the physiological way that some beings showed tiredness not in slowness but in the specific quality of their stillness. Admiral Wren, Third Voice said. I have been informed of the nature of the incoming fleet. The Drovan has long-range sensors too. Sova was not surprised. What do your sensors tell you? Nothing our instruments can adequately classify. But our chemoreceptors. Third Voice paused. Among Drovan, information travels through environmental chemistry as well as through speech. We can sense the emotional register of a region. The content of events is imprecise. Like a scent that tells you something has happened in a space before you arrived. What does this place smell like? Sova asked. Like the very early times, third voice said. Before anything was built. Before there was a word for what the space between stars was for. It paused. Among the Drovan, there is a word for when you do something irreversible and then understand too late, its full weight. We have this word because we have needed it. I know you damaged the corridor, Sova said. The compressed mass detonators. We knew, third voice said. Sova went very still. We knew the corridors were not natural, third voice said. We did not know their full significance. We did not know the cascade timeline. We knew they were old and engineered and load-bearing in some capacity we could not fully analyze. It paused. We used the detonators anyway. Because we were losing, and because we could not imagine that losing would leave us anything worth protecting. The silence stretched. Why are you telling me this? Sova asked. Because you came here instead of to the council, third voice said. You came to us first. And I am. It paused again and something moved in its chemical register that Sova couldn't detect directly but that Min, standing behind her with the translation instruments active, later described as a complex mixture of grief and resolution. I am trying to practice what the Drovan word requires. Not confession. Not an excuse. Presence with the full weight of a thing. You're trying to be accountable, Sova said. I am trying, third voice said, to understand what accountability looks like when the thing you must be accountable for is this large. Sova sat down. In the Drovan formal space which had no chairs, Drovan did not use chairs, she pulled over a surface and sat on it, which was not the right protocol but was, she felt, the right gesture. It made her smaller. It made her an entity sitting in someone else's space, acknowledging that it was theirs. Third voice's manipulator limbs shifted, a Drovan signal that Min had briefed her on. It meant, I noticed what you just did. I came here, Sova said, because the thing I'm about to ask you to do requires that you trust me at least partially. And I can't ask you for trust if I'm not willing to give it. I cannot come to you after the council has decided your role and then call it a partnership. So I'm here before the council asking, will you come with us? To the council. To the architects. To whatever comes next. Not that the defeated party is being managed. As a party with standing. We broke the thing you are trying to save, third voice said. Yes, Sova said. And we broke things too in the way we fought you. And the architects broke something when they left, in the way they left without telling anyone what they'd built and why. We are a galaxy of beings who have broken things. She paused. The question is what we do next. Third voice was very still for a long time. Then it said, the Drovan word I mentioned. For irreversible understanding. The full translation is, I cannot go back. The full translation is because I cannot go back, I must go forward in a way that carries this. Sova looked at it. That's the beginning of what we need. Only the beginning? The beginning is where everything starts, she said. That's why it matters. The Alliance Grand Council met in a space called the Convergence Hall at the center of Velithar Station. A vast, acoustically designed chamber where the architecture itself was meant to communicate equality. No elevated positions, every delegation at the same height and distance from the center, and the sight lines arranged so that every party could see every other party at all times. It had been designed as a symbol. It had, for most of its history, functioned as a symbol. The actual decisions were made in smaller rooms before the session, and the Convergence Hall was where those decisions were ratified. Sova intended to use it differently. She arrived with Min and her recordings, vessels and her archive, Thran and the captains who had stood beside her. And third voice of the Drovan walked through the entrance of Velithar Station for the first time in the history of the Drovan species, entering a space that had been built, ostensibly for every species in the Mid-Spiral Alliance but had never, until this moment, contained one of them. The hall was already in session when they arrived. The council had been briefed, minimally by Thren's tight beams, that Admiral Wren had made contact with the incoming fleet. They knew something significant had occurred. They did not know the shape of it. When the Drovan interlocutor walked in behind the Admiral, the hall went silent in the same way that rooms went silent when something happened outside the available categories. Sova presented. For 2 hours she presented the data, the signal, Min's translations, vessel's historical context, the architect's full communication as recorded, the physics of the corridor degradation and the cascade timeline. She presented it without advocacy. She laid it down and let it sit in the space and let every delegation process it on their own terms. The ISOM with their crest leaves going through a full range of positions. The Parath clusters are rearranging and rearranging. The Duvari sensors were turning, sensing things in the data that no one else could sense, and the bubbles from their translation tanks were coming faster. Then she made the argument. Not for forgiveness. She did not advocate for unity as an abstract principle. She made the argument for survival as a specific physical necessity. Here is the timeline, here is the mechanism, here is what coherence means in terms of the physics of what they all depended on, and here is why coherence without the Drovan was not physically achievable because the Drovan were inside the network and you could not have coherence in a network with 11 billion incoherent nodes. The objections came. They came hard, and they came from places of genuine pain, and Sova heard every one of them fully, because that was what the moment required. She heard the captain who had lost a colony world. She heard the Parath cluster representative, who had been separated from their distributed selves during the war in ways that had caused permanent cognitive impairment. She heard the Isom who simply said quietly, "They chose this." And she said every time in different words, "Yes, and now we choose. Yes, and now the choice is ours." It was third voice who changed the room. It stood and spoke without being called upon, a breach of council protocol, and before the procedural objection could be raised it said, "I am going to tell you what we knew about the corridors." And then it told them. Fully, without defense, with the carrying quality of the Drovan word that had no adequate translation. It told them what the Drovan had known and done and chosen, and what that choosing looked like from inside a desperation so complete that it had absorbed everything else. The hall was hushed when it finished. Not the quiet of acceptance. The quiet of a room in which something real had happened. The first voice after the quiet was a Veth elder on the council, ancient, a third generation back from space travel, with secondary eyes so wide they almost met. She said, "The Admiral has not asked us for an answer today." Sova looked at her. "No," she agreed. "You've asked us to begin something, to start a process." "Yes." "And the architects are holding the degradation for 25 years." "Yes." The elder was quiet for a moment. "In old Veth philosophy," she said, "there is a concept called Mayrath, the memory of empty space." She looked around the room. "The texts say that the void does not choose what it remembers. It retains everything that passes through it with equal fidelity. A battle and a conversation leave the same kind of trace." She paused. "We have left many traces in this space. It is time, I think, to be more careful about what we leave." She placed her hands flat on the council table, the Veth gesture for, "I am finished speaking and I will not be moved." "I vote to begin," she said. It was not unanimous. Nothing real ever was. But it was enough. The Veth elders' motion passed, not to ratify a plan because no full plan existed yet, but to authorize the next phase, joint working groups inclusive of Drovan representation, to develop the protocol for network maintenance and the framework for what coherence, practically and politically, would require. 25 years as a working timeframe. Min's communication protocol as a tool for the process. The architect fleet acted as a consultative presence, available but not directive. They had been obvious that the decisions were not theirs to make and would never be theirs to make. Sova left the hall and stood in a corridor outside, her back against the wall, and let herself be very tired for approximately 5 minutes. Callow appeared. He had been in the hall in the back the whole time. He brought her something to drink. A Veth hydration compound that the Armada supply chain produced by the leader because Sova forgot to drink when she was working. She took it. "It passed," he said. "It passed," she agreed. "That's not the same as it working." "No. That's not the same as it working." He stood next to her in the corridor, in the comfortable silence of two people who had been in difficult rooms together many times. Outside the station viewport, the lights of Velithar's twin moons were crossing, the fourth rotation of the celebration. Still going, slower now, the initial release of the victory settling into something quieter and more sustained. "What do we do now?" Callow asked. Sova thought about it. "We go back to the architect," she said, "and tell them the council voted. And then we start the work." She paused. "Which is the part that doesn't end. Right?" Callow said. "How long does it go on for?" "As long as it takes," she said. "And then the people who come after us continue it. And then the people who come after them." She pushed off the wall. "That's what the corridors are for. Not just getting from one place to another. The whole thing. All of it. Getting from one place to another is the easy part." She walked toward the docking bay. Callow fell into step beside her. 25 years. They are a long time when you are inside them. Sova was 53 when she stood in the interior of the architect's vessel and asked for 25 years. She was 78 when the first generation of the network maintenance protocol came into effect. When the first jointly staffed monitoring station came online at the Karath Passage load point, crewed by Veth and Perith and Duvari and Drovan working in the same space, checking the same systems, and communicating in the evolving version of Min's direct meaning protocol that had, over 2 decades of use and refinement, become something that had no predecessor and no adequate name. The work was not clean. It was not a sequence of successes. It was a long, irregular process of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, of agreements falling apart and being remade in different forms, of people dying and being replaced by people who had to be convinced again from the beginning and sometimes convinced differently because the world had changed around them and the original argument needed updating. There were 3 major diplomatic crises in the first decade. A Drovan faction rejected the joint protocol and required years of separate negotiations to restore it. An ISOM generation that grew up in the early post-war period, who had been shaped by the war as children, and who carried a version of grief that was expressed as anger in ways that needed to be received rather than dismissed. The Duvari contributed something unexpected. They had, it turned out, been maintaining something like the Min protocol independently for millennia, a deep-frequency communication method that operated at the same level as the Architect's direct meaning transmission but in a much more localized and species-specific way. When this emerged through the working groups, it changed the way everyone understood Duvari culture, and it changed the protocol development significantly, because Min and the Duvari physicists had been approaching the same problem from opposite ends, and when they found each other they moved much faster. Callow became, over the years, the primary liaison between the joint working groups and the Architect fleet, which maintained its column formation just outside Velithar Station throughout the entire period, patient and vast and warm, occasionally sending signals that Min's team translated with increasing speed and depth. He developed a communication with the entity they had designated the first Architect that went, over time, beyond translation into something more direct. A wordless working relationship built on the shared project of maintaining something that mattered. He told Sova once, in the 15th year, that the first Architect had asked him a question. "What question?" she asked. "It asked me what I thought the corridors were actually for," he said. "Not what the Architect told us. What I thought." "What did you say?" He thought about it for a moment. He was older now, past the marker that the Veth considered full adult, his secondary eyes holding the particular depth of experience that they developed in middle years. "I said I thought they were for what Min said. Communication. Getting from misunderstanding to understanding. This process is not achieved in a single conversation, but rather over an extended period." He paused. And the Architect said, he stopped. "What?" It said, "Yes, and also, so that you are not alone." Sova was quiet for a moment. And I said, "Those might be the same thing." He paused again. And it was quiet for a while and then it said, "Yes. We came to understand that very late." Min published her full protocol in the 17th year. She was 114, which was midlife for a Perith, and her cluster had grown from 2 to 5 new selves. Grown through the Perith developmental process that was not birth but was like birth, the emergence of new cognitive extensions into a shared selfhood. She told Sova, at the publication event, that she had been more afraid of publishing than of anything she had done in the war. "Why?" Sova asked. "Because the language can be misused," Min said. "Language that closes the gap between meaning and reception. It can be used for manipulation as easily as for understanding. More easily. It bypasses the skeptical distance that protects people from being misled." She paused. I had to decide whether the risk was worth it. And the Architect's transmission was that language at full scale was used perfectly for 400 years, and it was used to build the framework that allowed everything we are. She paused. I decided the question wasn't whether the tool was dangerous. The question was whether the species using it was developing enough to handle it. Are we? 25 years ago I would have said I didn't know. Now, she looked around the event space. Veth and Drovan and Isalm and Duvari and Perith, mixed in a room in a way that would have been unimaginable when she was a child. Not without tension. Not without the careful maintenance that all real relationships require. But they are present together, working together, and building something together that none of them could build alone. Now I think we might be getting there, she said. Slowly. Imperfectly. Which is the only way anything real ever gets anywhere. Vessels died in the 22nd year. She was ancient. Her crest leaves had gone from amber to a deep, quiet brown, and her branching limbs had become the slow, deliberate things of an Isalm in their final years, moving with the weight of every season they had seen. She died in the archive room she had been assigned on the unbroken meridian, Sova had kept her there, had made the ship her home for the duration. Surrounded by the oldest ISOM texts she had spent a lifetime studying and had spent these last 22 years rereading with completely different eyes. She left Sova a message. She had recorded it 2 weeks before she died, in the way that the ISOM did. Sitting very still, crest fully extended, speaking into a recording device with the calm of someone who had already made peace with the impermanence of specific forms while remaining entirely confident in the permanence of what mattered. "You asked me," she said in the recording, "how far back I needed to look. I looked as far back as the texts go and I found something I want to tell you before I go. The oldest ISOM texts, the oldest ones, the ones that predate anything we call history, do not begin with the ISOM. They begin with the space. With a description of empty space and what the empty space was like before anyone moved through it. And the description is not neutral. It is written in the vocabulary of longing. Whoever wrote it, whoever, in the very early period of our civilization, first tried to put words to what the void was, wrote about it as though it were waiting. We now know what it was waiting for. It was waiting to be used as it was designed to be. Not as a battlefield. Not as an obstacle. As a medium. It serves as the space through which voices can travel and arrive. You gave it that. You and everyone who stood with you and everyone who will stand with what you built. The space between stars is different now than it was when you were born. Not physically. Not in any way an instrument can measure. But its use is different. Memory is what space is made of. You have given the void something new to remember. That is enough. That is more than enough. Go on. The ceremony was not what Sova had imagined. She had imagined something formal. Something with the specific weight of official events, speeches, declarations, and the translation of a long process into a single symbolic moment that could be remembered and referred to. She had expected a ceremony that would produce a founding document, a date, and a clear indication of when it happened. Instead, it happened gradually, across a period of about 6 months, in dozens of separate moments in different places, and what the 25th year marked was not the completion of anything but the transition into a different kind of continuity. The corridor monitoring protocol became, in the 25th year, self-sustaining in the administrative sense, meaning it no longer required the personal presence of specific individuals to maintain its function. It had developed institutions, traditions, a training program, a next generation of practitioners who had grown up knowing this work is simply what we do. Not exceptional, not heroic, not a response to a crisis. Just the ordinary, careful, necessary maintenance of something that mattered. That was the thing Sova had been trying to build, and she had not been sure it was possible to build until she saw it, and when she saw it she had to sit down, alone, in a room on the unbroken meridian, and be very quiet for a while. Callow found her there. "You're doing the thing," he said. "What thing?" "The thing where you've finished something and you don't know how to be a person who has finished it." She looked at him. He was, she thought, the best decision she had ever made, choosing him as her second officer, trusting the way his careful mind worked, and letting him grow into the person he was rather than the officer she needed. In the end, of course, those had been the same thing. "What comes next?" she asked. "You retire?" he said. "I've never retired." "I know. That's why it'll be intriguing." She thought about the architect. The first architect, whom Callow had spent 15 years in regular communication with. "Do they know that we made it?" "I told them 3 days ago," Callow said. "When the protocol review was returned, it was self-sustaining." "What did they say?" He sat down beside her. Outside the viewport, the corridor load point monitoring station was visible. A small, bright object against the dark, crewed by 9 people representing 5 species, maintaining a thing they understood in its full depth and attended to with the care it deserved. It said, "We have been watching this since the beginning." And I asked it what it had seen, and it was quiet for a moment, and then it said, "The same thing we always see when a species understands what we built." "What's that?" "Relief," Callow said. It said, "Relief. We built it alone. It was always supposed to be inhabited together." Sova looked at the monitoring station. "They're lonely," she said. "We're," Callow said. "I think we're, is the right word now." They sat together in the quiet of the ship that had been her home for longer than she could usefully remember, in the space where a great deal of the universe's important work had been done by people who were, fundamentally, just trying to do the next right thing because the next right thing was what they could reach. Outside, stars. Between the stars, corridors. In the corridors, everything that moved, everything that called out, everything that was trying to arrive somewhere and be understood. The void remembering. 3 years after the ceremony that was not a ceremony, the architect fleet moved. Not retreated. Not departed in the way of leaving. They moved the way they had arrived, in column, in procession, but the direction was inward, toward the core. Toward wherever the inward journey led that the ISOM texts had described and failed to describe. Sova was on Velithar Station when it happened. Retired, she was involved in things without having formal authority over them, a situation she had decided was probably the best arrangement. She had been in a meeting, a working session with the third generation of network monitors, young beings of 5 species who spoke Min's protocol as a first language and used it without thinking, the way young people used any language they had grown up inside. The meeting stopped when the architect fleet began to move. Everyone went to viewports. Sova stood at the large observation window, the same window where 28 years ago she had stood watching the stars and felt the wrongness that she couldn't yet name. The column of vast shapes moved past, as slow as the movement of something that had no reason to hurry. The first architect's vessel was the last in the column, at the rear, and as it passed the station, it did something that none of the instruments could classify and that every biological sensor on the station registered simultaneously. It was not a sound. It was not a light. It was the direct meaning transmission, Min's signal, the architect's native communication, at a scale and frequency that bypassed every mediating layer and arrived, unfiltered, in the center of every living thing on the station. And what it said was very simple. It said, remember that you are enough. Not humans. Not any specific species. The transmission, which Min's team analyzed later, had been calibrated for every species on the station simultaneously, different physiological reception, same content. Each species received it in the form that made the most sense to their particular biology. The Veth felt it in their resonance ridges. The Perith felt it in their distributed selves, the separate parts of them suddenly profoundly aware of their connection. The Duvari felt it in the deep pressure channels that connected them to the ocean they no longer had. The ISOM felt it in their crest leaves, in the photosynthetic tissue that had always, at some level, been tuned to something it couldn't name. The Drovan felt it in the chemical register of the air, the oldest sense they had, the sense that had always known things before they could be spoken. And then the column turned inward and past the outer edge of the sensor range and was gone. Sova stood at the viewport for a long time after. She was 78 years old and she was retired and she was standing in a station crewed by the children of the people who had won a war, and those children were going to grow up and have children of their own who would maintain corridors they had never seen broken, who would use a communication protocol as casually as they used any other tool, who would know that the Drovan were their partners in the maintenance of something they all needed, who would perhaps never fully know the weight of what that had cost to become true and would carry it anyway, in the specific way that all beings carried the gifts of those who came before them. Imperfectly, incompletely, but forward. Callow appeared at her shoulder. He was always at her shoulder when it mattered, and she thought about how that was, in itself, a form of coherence, the kind that was built person by person, day by day, in the small and vast space of choosing to remain beside someone. Well, he said. Well, she agreed. They said we were enough. Yes. Do you believe that? She thought about it. She thought about the war and the battle, and the silence she had chosen at Karath Passage. The decision that had apparently made her legible to beings who had been watching for someone who understood silence as an act rather than an absence. She thought about the fracture and the long work of repairing not the corridors but the will to maintain them. She thought about Third Voice carrying the weight of what the Drovan had known and done. She thought about Vessels, gone now, and Min and her 5-self cluster, and Thren, who had stood beside her at the council and never stopped being afraid and had never let the fear make his decisions for him, which was perhaps the most important definition of courage she had ever seen. She thought about what it meant to be enough. Not finished. Not perfect. Not beyond error. Just sufficient to the task of continuing. Yes, she said. I believe it. Outside the stars continued. Between them, the corridors running deep, maintained by living beings who had decided, over 25 years of difficult and imperfect effort, that maintenance was what they were for. The void remembered everything. Every battle, yes. Every fracture. But also, every conversation. Every agreement made and kept. Every moment where a being who had beneficial reasons to stop chose instead to continue. The memory of space is not neutral. It holds what passes through it with equal care, which means the quality of what passes through it matters. What you send into the dark between stars is what the dark becomes. Send voices. Send the slow, effortful work of understanding. Send the willingness to be in the same space as those you have harmed and those who have harmed you, not for the erasure of that history, but for the building of something that does not require the hatred of anyone to remain standing. The architects built the corridors. The afterlife filled the corridors. This is what came after.